Hello, everyone. Welcome to Zoom. I'm sure you've had plenty of it of late. Today's topic is something that has been increasingly important to me and to Strawberry Bank Museum as we grapple with what has been called the most important initiative that Strawberry Bank has ever undertaken. And that is the Sea Level Rise Initiative. And it's important because it's a direct threat to many of the buildings that many of you probably know perfectly well, but so let's get going here. We don't have a ton of time, and I want to make sure we get through this. So Strawberry Bank Museum is this beautiful, idyllic setting in the south end of Portsmouth. It's basically this whole area right in here, and of our main concern today, of course, is what is called Puddle Dock, what used to be a waterway. You can see the beautiful Prescott River in the foreground. And if we flop around here, you can see the river in the background now, the skating rink in the front. And this area here is the area of concern. So although it's a beautiful setting, it is plagued by a couple of things. One, you have higher elevations in this image. Over here, this is all higher ground, which drains down this direction, especially down Atkinson Street. And then over here, what would be our parking lot and the South End neighborhood, that's all higher ground, and that drains down into Puddle Dock. And of course, you've got the river, which at one point, before they filled it in the early 20th century, used to come ebb and flow with the tide into the Puddle Dock area. Now, the problem with that is that you have all this water coming down and you have nowhere for it to go. And so Strawberry Bank really becomes a gigantic bowl and it fills up with water. When the river is high, that's especially problematic because the storm drain is also full of salt water. And you also have what's called upwelling or groundwater that is surging underneath, just like it always did. Puddle Dock still exists underground. Then that water is being pushed up higher and higher, reaching areas where it never reached before and preventing surface water from draining away. So this is what I'm talking about today and what Strawberry Bank is working on and how to address it. So the three main houses that we're most concerned with right now are the three at the top. The Driscoll House on the far right, the 1695 Sherburne House, and the 1790 Peter Loud House. Those buildings are what I call ground zero. They're right on Puddle Dock, and they are most at risk. The higher up on elevation you go, the better it gets. And we can see that if we go to the recently released FEMA flood maps, which have been superimposed a Google map. And so if you're looking at this image, you can see here's Prescott Park right here. You're very familiar with that. The Gundalow Park's right about here. So this is all Strawberry Bank. Here's the restaurant parking lot. This is Shapley, Driscoll, Sherburne, and Loud right in here. And so you can see that their projections in this whole area, and why water has a memory, what once was water, what once was Puddle Dock, is projected to flood again. And you can see the impact is all the way back to this would be the Jones house way back here, and we see that already in the basement of Jones. It's a little clearer if you look at the same flood map, but it's now been superimposed over a city of Portsmouth map. This is their geo map. And again, you can see here's the river, Prescott Park. And so here's Shapley, Driscoll, and Sherburne. They show as one building because they're so close together, but then there's the Loud House right here. And you can see that the buildings that are threatened by sea level rise due to whether it be storm surges or whether it be astronomically high tides, these are the buildings that are susceptible to floods within the next 100 years. The deceiving part of this is that even though this is showing projected surface flooding issues within the next 100 years, and that is obviously a concern. But what we're seeing already is that upwelling I told you about, that groundwater being pushed into the basement of those houses because the water is already there. So this is a threat to Strawberry Bank right now. It's not something that we have time to deal with in the next 100 years. We've got problems right now, and they're only going to get worse. I'm sure many of you have seen this beautiful shot of a flooded Puddle Dock. Unfortunately, it seems to happen more and more these days. You can see the Shapley Driscoll house, the Sherburne, and the Loud house in the background there. And this is the problem that I've been talking to you about, how this bowl keeps filling up with water until it reaches our basements. Beautiful shot by David Murray, our photographer of the skating rink. He was obviously going for the beautiful colors, but what do you see in the foreground but a gigantic pond of water, which is very problematic given the proximity to our houses. These were taken, I guess, just about a year ago, year and a half ago. On the left, you have our carpentry shop. You can see how the ponding, these are in incredibly hard downpours. Well, we'll get an inch of rain in a very short period of time. And again, that water has no place to go. So it completely fills up the basin that was Puddle Dock. And so you've got buildings that are, the water's right up to them. You've got buildings like the Jones House in the center, where the water has reached the bulkhead right here. And when it reaches that point, what we see is this much water in the basement. In this particular case, the furnace was destroyed, and the furnace is 24 inches above the floor of the basement. So it gives you an idea how much water was in that space. So these are, you know, again, these are real impacts that are happening right now. Of course, it's not a unique issue to Strawberry Bank. I'm sure you've read about sea level rise issues in the newspaper. You've seen it in the news. In fact, the nor'easter that hit us just yesterday saw some substantial, so what they called moderate coastal flooding. But this is more and more typical. We're seeing this every year now. It's not a rare occasion, it's every year. This image here is the causeway to the town of Newcastle. It was a great causeway when it was built almost 100 years ago, but now it floods on a fairly regular basis, and it's something the state of New Hampshire knows they have to deal with. This is a house in the South End, which is impacted by water quite frequently now. Again, you know, these buildings were built a long time ago. The elevation wasn't a problem at that point, but because of sea level rise, because the water's being forced higher and higher, these areas are now being impacted. And this is the Newcastle Common. Many of you have been there. This is the Newcastle Beach right here. You can see this is the picnic area. This is where they do grilling and stuff, and it just completely overran that area. So what's the matter with having water in your basement? Well, besides if you have 2 feet, that's a whole nother matter. But if you have just an inch, you think you can deal with it. The problem is that the frequency is increasing. And so what you have is obvious decay of metal objects due to rust. Here's an original brick chimney foundation that is completely deteriorating. The mortar is going. Obviously, everything that's made of wood is susceptible to wood rot, and we're seeing that. We had one of the floors in the Shapley Driscoll house let go when one of these posts that you see right here completely rotted and let go. And so you have this tremendous amount of decay that's happening quite rapidly because it is salt water, and the frequency is increasing. Along with all that moisture, of course, comes humidity. And if you've been outside on a very hot, sticky day, you know what humidity is like, and you know that it causes mold and mildew issues. So here's a readout from the Shapley Driscoll house that we did several years ago, showing the relative humidity for a 6-month period between 80 and 90% in that basement of that building. And so when you go to that building, this is what you see. You see mold and mildew growing. Again, you have wood rot. Insects are very happy in that kind of climate. They need a certain water content in the wood. So carpenter ants, powder post beetles, very typical impacts that we're seeing from all of this water. So what's the response? Well, the response is that we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to make sure that other people are aware of the threats to Strawberry Bank. And again, it's not just Strawberry Bank, but it's all over the country, all over the globe. And so we have to let people know that this is going on and that our very history could be lost. This is an amazing report that came out in the spring of 2018. It's sort of the New Hampshire's report, if you will, on the impacts of climate change. And what I really liked about that is they cited Strawberry Bank in its report because they felt that it was such an important site, one that was actively being threatened, actively being impacted. And so they wanted to make sure that this was part of the state report. And of course, we have to respond. So we do research, we kind of understand what's going on as best we can. There's a few initiatives going on at Strawberry Bank. I'm sure many of you have seen on YouTube the video of the basement of the Shapley Driscoll house that was done by David Murray. It's a 3-minute time lapse that shows the incoming tide entering this basement. We measured 16 inches of water on a typical sunny December day back in, I believe, 2018. And then 2 months later, we had a gigantic nor'easter, and I went down and measured again, and we had 26 inches of water in this basement. The water comes in 2 hours and goes back out in 2 hours. It's just connected to the tidal cycle because that's how the water's getting pushed into the basement. You can see some measuring that we're doing here to determine the depth of the water and how frequent. And then for hydrologists to understand how the groundwater is moving and how it's getting into our basements, we've begun to install these ground wells. This is the apparatus that actually drills the well and puts a cap on it. And our plan is to team with UNH and have sensors put into these wells so that we can follow real-time data as to the depth of the water in the wells and the salinity of the water that's there. And so with a bunch of these around the site, we can begin to map out how the water is moving and perhaps how we can keep it from getting into our basements. The City of Portsmouth is undertaking its own vulnerability assessment. Obviously, they've got a much larger area to be concerned about, but they did invite Strawberry Bank to the table to talk about the issues that we're seeing at Strawberry Bank. I was a member of the Citizens Advisory Committee for this effort. And one of the things that Strawberry Bank added to that conversation was the impact of groundwater. The city was really focused on surface flooding issues because that's what we see. The roads are being closed and seawalls being breached. But there's a clear and current impact from groundwater intrusion. And so now they've taken a step back and they're trying to understand what those impacts may be and how wide that is in the city of Portsmouth. Basically, my job of late has been to advocate for what we're doing, just like this talk right here. It's to get the message to as many people as we possibly can in areas all around the country and the world. And the reason for that is twofold. Obviously, one, we're going to need to raise money to solve this problem. But the more important goal is to be a voice for change, that we can advocate that rather than lose our history, lose our heritage, we need to work together to save it and to solve this problem. There's some examples here. There was a great Yankee Magazine article written by Howard Mansfield. He used Strawberry Bank as one of the 3 or 4 sites in the article as under threat. And then an op-ed piece that I wrote for the Portsmouth Herald, just inviting people to make sure they know understand their impacts, know what's going on, and try to be part of the solution. One of the best sort of outreach venues that I've been to is the Keeping History Above Water conference, which is put on by the Newport Restoration Foundation. It is, I think, in its 4th year. I spoke at the one in Maryland. It is the only opportunity for all sorts of organizations like Strawberry Bank to get into a room with scientists, to learn what the science is behind sea level rise, but also with other organizations who are faced with the same issue. Annapolis is one of the most interesting impact areas. If you think about the eastern coast of New Hampshire, perhaps we have some time in New England to respond to this threat, but the farther south you go, the worse it gets. Annapolis has got incredible impacts already. Florida, of course, we see in the news all the time. New Orleans lost much of their heritage in the hurricanes. So there are people that are sort of farther along than the city of Portsmouth and Strawberry Bank, and so it's great to be in a room where we can talk and share solutions. You learn a lot that way, and it feels pretty good to share stories. We formed a lot of partnerships. Partnerships are so key to everything that we're working on right now, whether it's from the scientific community that can help us understand the impacts and define them better, or it's from other organizations who are either dealing with the same problem or believe they need to start preparing for what's coming. So these are just some of our partnerships that we've picked up over the last 4 or 5 years. So the museum is in the capital campaign. I think many of you know that. One of the things we added to the capital campaign was the Sea Level Rise Initiative. Basically, there are going to be things that Strawberry Bank can do to help itself. And then there are going to be the larger problems that are going to have to be solved with help from the city of Portsmouth and probably the state of New Hampshire. So this money is to really help us look at each particular building as a case-by-case basis, understand the impacts, and then begin to adapt those buildings to take on the problem. And we've started to do that in some of the buildings already. This is a great example of, on the left here, you've got what was an open sump pump. Almost of all of our houses have sump pumps. They always have. There's always been water issues. But of late, the sump pumps can't keep up. So we have to deal with that. But the problem with sump pumps is that they are a holder of water, which then releases water vapor into the air and causes those humidity issues I talked about. So here you can see the new version that we put in that's completely sealed. I talked about the Jones house being flooded. You can see here how the water has reached the bulkhead, cascades down the basement stairs, and floods the basement, damaging the infrastructure and the furnace. So the fix was simply to change the angle of the bulkhead. So we now have about a foot of visible brick. So that water can now pool up in this area, but it won't be able to get into the basement. The other thing, while we were digging here, we put a pond membrane along the foundation wall here. So even as imperfections occur in the foundation, that water will come up to it, but it can't get through the membrane and get into the basement. So this is done, you know, from about the 2 foot of water that we had in there, we're now down to probably a trickle. It's an amazing difference. Cleaning up our basements is a really good thing because once everything gets soaking wet down there, not only is it useless, but it just sits there and rots. So these are what we like to see our basements look like when we're done. This is part of the sad story here. This is the Peter Loud house. This is the basement of the Peter Loud house. You can see the plaster on the ceiling here. This was a finished space. This was called a summer kitchen. And this area right here, there used to be a huge hearth that they would use to do open hearth cooking in the summer months when it was hot. They would actually use this on here because it was cooler. This chimney base sat in salt water for so many decades that it literally rotted the brick until it was so soft and crumbly we couldn't save it. And more importantly, though, the brick acts as a wick, and it was wicking the water up into the stack all the way up to the first floor so that the damage was continuing up above. We made the difficult decision. The only way we could stop that process was to put in a material, in this case granite, that would prevent that water from wicking up. So we have preserved the rest of this chimney stack, but we've lost this piece of history. And in my humble opinion, this is one example of other things that are going to happen in this country to save what we can. Some things are going to be lost. It's just, that's the way it's going to be. Some other examples of work that we've done around the site. This is a perimeter drain system in the Loud house. So you can see all these drains are actually coming along the foundation all the way around it. gathering the water that may try to enter this basement, depositing into the sump pump, and then it's discharged out. In the Jones house, now that we've got the water under control, we put in a humidification system. This allows that any water that may come in or any moisture that comes in will immediately be evaporated within a very short period of time, which keeps the insect issue away and mold and mildew issues at bay as well. If we don't need to do a concrete floor like you see over here, again, this is the Loud house, so it's right on Puddle Dock. The houses that are higher up may have water issues, but they're much less. And so what we can do here, in this case, is do a moisture membrane. You can see the plastic right here. We cover it with rock, and we make sure that any elements aren't down into that moist area. So in this case, we've put the support columns on concrete block to keep them high and dry, so that they won't corrode if there is a water issue. So at Strawberry Bank, it was not our intent, being a museum, to teach about sea level rise, about what it is and the impacts. But we realized that we are a venue and we have a voice. And so we decided that, in fact, rather than being something we might do down the road after all of the problems have been solved, we needed to teach this problem to our visitors now. And so we began to design a gallery exhibit that will open up in the gallery space, probably, if not in 2021, and certainly in 2022. It's going to be done probably by May or June. We just have to wait for the pandemic to settle down so people can enter the gallery safely. This is one of the panels. We have partnered with the city of Portsmouth on this project. The city of Portsmouth gets money from the EPA, and part of that money has to be used for public outreach. And the city recognizes that Strawberry Bank has a much better voice and much better venue for public outreach than the city is itself. So they have partnered with us, and this particular board, you can see here, is all about stormwater, what it is, where it goes. So, you know, if water goes into this drain right here, do people know where it goes? And if they know where it goes, are they careful about what goes down that drain? And how can we minimize what goes down that drain so that we're not putting water, in this case, in the Prescott River, which is then going to bubble up into the Strawberry Bank's basements? So how do we control stormwater is what this panel's about. And you can see all these little messages around. And when you go into the gallery, you'll see that each one of these black dots is actually a metal loop. It's an eye screw, and there's string yarn in little bins next to the panel. And I can't remember if I have a picture of that. But basically what people are going to do is they're going to run their piece of yarn along those goals that they want to achieve in their life to help with, in this particular case, the stormwater situation. The entire gallery experience is to inform and get people to react and get people to take the message back to their communities and try to make a positive difference. So this is the entry panel for the exhibit. You can see a quote from that article I mentioned from Howard Mansfield in Yankee Magazine. This panel is the whole entry wall as you come into the, what would be the vestibule of the gallery. We're going to be adding what's called a gobo light, and it will simulate waves and water on the ground of the vestibule. So as you enter, there'll be not just a visual experience, but you'll actually feel like you're walking on water. This is one of the most exciting components of the gallery exhibit. So if you picture the gallery, there's a single window that faces east, and it faces down Puddle Dock. You can see, for example, the Liberty Pole from that perspective. What we wanted to do, because we are a museum, but we also wanted to teach about sea level rise, we wanted to show visitors how that view shed, how that viewscape changed over time. So in this particular case, we wanted to show what the Puddle Dock venue or viewscape looked like before European inhabitants moved here. So here you have one of the Algonquin tribe in their birch bark canoe doing some gillnet fishing. And then you could see the banks of what was the Puddle Dock Inlet, and then the river in the background, and Kittery in the in the way background. So that's just an example of what it will look like. So when visitors come in, they're going to see a gigantic flat screen TV, and there'll be these date buttons at the bottom, 1600, 1700, 1800. As they touch those, the shutters will open, and this is what they're going to see. And in addition to the image reflecting what it looked like during that period, there are going to be drawers that you touch and open up, and there'll be objects that refer back to that particular period. So there, in the 1600s, for example, there might be archaeological artifacts related to the Native American presence on Puddle Dock, for example. At the opposite end of the scale, we have what the Puddle Dock looked like during the 10, 20, 30, 40s, 50s, before urban renewal. And you can see the Liberty Pole in the background there. This is what was called Newton Avenue and Scruton Avenue shooting off to the side. And there's always going to be some key references, but it's going to be very difficult for visitors to see it. And I don't know if you'll recognize it, but in fact, this is the Loud House and this is the Shapley Driscoll House. So, but the one point that always remains, at least from the 1800s forward, is the Liberty Pole. So the real goal of this is, despite we want to show the history, the evolution of that view shed, we also want to engage people into making a choice. And so you can see the last button up here is the future. And we talked a lot about what to do for imaging for the future. And we finally actually changed this button, this future button. It's actually going to be two buttons. And the future is going to be if we react and if we delay. And so you can see, if we don't get moving on this issue and respond and adapt, this is perhaps what happens to Strawberry Bank over time. However, if we do work together and we do come up with solutions and we do adapt, perhaps we can have more 4th of July celebrations like we've experienced in the last decade. Some of the other imaging from the gallery exhibit, again, partnering with the city of Portsmouth for some of the data they've collected. And just much of the material that I've gone through with you today. In addition to the gallery itself, we felt it was important to have a visual presence of this issue outside of our houses, so that when the museum is closed and people are walking around the site, they too will learn about this problem and make some choices and decisions in what they can do in their lives to make it better. So this is a new panel that's right across the front entrance of the Shapley Driscoll House. And it will be there as a marker to explain the circumstances that are happening on the site going forward. There's also another one that the Rockingham Planning Commission in partnership with the city and Strawberry Bank installed on Marcy Street over here. So that's an important story. There's this one right here, actually. And this is a fun one because it actually shows you projected flood levels on these little markers right here. And I can tell you that this site right here, this is the 100-year storm, how high the water might get. If you were to put this on the foundation of the Loud House, it's about 3/4 of the way up the brick foundation. That's how much water this would be on Puddle Dock. So that's my tale. There's some unbelievable resources on our website under the Sea Level Rise Initiative section. The city of Portsmouth as well. I leave you with the thought that if you don't believe that there's impacts in your lives from sea level rise, that you need to dig a little bit deeper and ask some questions. All communities should be involved in this, whether it's for surface water issues, river flooding, ocean flooding. It's going to become a problem in every community. The FEMA flood maps that I mentioned to you, which were recently updated, became a big topic in all communities because it's related to flood insurance. And so that's been a really good way for people to understand the impacts, the potential impacts in their particular areas. They're available for free on the internet. You can search by your own address. But even if your address, maybe you're high up on a hill, but maybe there's something in the center of your town that you're completely in love with, whether it's a historic house or maybe just a friend's home, you'd be surprised how the impacts can be found just about everywhere. So thank you very much. And I guess I can open it up for questions.
All right, and I invite anybody with a question to type that right into chat, and I will present those questions to Rodney. Rodney, I'd like to start with our first question. What impact, or do you have a sense of what impact the Prescott Park Master Plan will have on Puddle Dock?
That's an interesting question. The master plan for Prescott Park was actually well on its way to being completed when the Citizens Advisory Committee and the vulnerability assessment sort of caught up to it with the city of Portsmouth. And so they added another phase to that, which was recently completed, which was to look at the elevations of Prescott Park and determine what needed to be done to protect those vulnerable structures. So that work is complete. They have a very good assessment of what they need to do. They just don't have any solutions yet as to what they're going to, what they might build or what they might do to modify or adapt those vulnerable areas. The groundwater is still kind of elusive. It's a very difficult thing to assess the groundwater impacts. They know that if Strawberry Bank is having groundwater impacts, then certainly what was a waterway at Prescott Park is also seeing those tidal impacts. They're trying to understand what the impacts are for residents in the South End, businesses in the South End. I had a gentleman come up to me after one of these talks and say that he didn't understand why a lot of the infrastructure in his basement was decaying quickly, why he was seeing rust, mold and mildew, when he never saw standing water. And what he came to realize was that the soils under his house were constantly saturated in water. And so that off-gassing was consistent. And so as a result, he had high humidity levels in his basement, and those things were just rotting away. The city would love to get a better picture, but that's a very difficult thing to do because it's a lot of private property ownership. So.
And can you talk a little bit about the cost that flooding has had, the structural and mechanical impact in terms of cost over the last decade?
Yeah, I mean, we've been living it. The easiest impacts are those that destroy furnaces. So we lost a furnace in Jones' house that I mentioned to you. We've lost the furnace in Loud House once already. Those are clear and knowing costs. The furnace in the Shapley-Driscoll house, they were very smart. They put it in the attic. Furnaces don't work well in the attic, but that's the only place you can put it if you want it to survive more than 12 months. That has its own problems, having a furnace in the attic, like ice damming, for example. But that's where it is. So those kind of costs are very tangible, very easily defined. What we are working on now are the larger costs, and I'll use for example, the Shapley-Driscoll house. Shapley-Driscoll house is suffering from rot and brick decay. It has yet to be seen whether we can actually save the architectural features in the basement. Like we did in Loud, we're gonna have to figure out a way to protect those areas, like the chimney bases, from the flooding. And it's so deep down there, we're not real sure how to do that. One of the conversations that we are starting to have is how we balance historic preservation with the need to adapt these buildings for the water. And so if you look at the Shapley-Driscoll house, you might say, like we did in Loud, do we give up the basement to save the house? Do we lift up the Shapley-Driscoll house, fill the basement with concrete, and set the building back down? I don't know. We would lose a tremendous amount of history, but we would also save some. It would solve the problem for sure. That's the sort of thing we have to grapple with in the coming years, is how far we have to go to protect these houses and what we are going to lose in the process. The costs are going to be substantial because it isn't just one building. There's the Shapley Driscoll house. The Loud house is in great shape. I think we've solved that problem. Jones house, I think that one's in great shape as well. The Sherburne house, which is undergoing a planning study right now, has significant impacts as well. The chimney stack that was built as a reproduction in 1968, I believe, was already compromised and was actually pulling the building down because the foundation of the chimney was letting go. So that chimney is now gone because we needed to save the structure. And we'll put something else back up, but we have to figure out how to support it in soils that are completely compromised by the river water.
Okay, and the last question we have you come across or are you aware of any historical sources or evidence that indicate flooding has been a problem for the residents of Puddle Dock in the past?
That's a good question. We've always wondered how long the flooding has been going on in the Shapley Driscoll house. I don't know for sure. If you talk to John Schlitzler, our restoration carpenter, who's been at Strawberry Bank for over 40 years, I think in hindsight, he believes that it's been going on for several decades. And I think at first it was probably not visible, but the soils in that basement were constantly saturated from what was just below the ground. So that led to its own problems. But now you have, standing water all the time, at least a week, a month. So, the problem has gotten worse, and which means that the decay speeds up. But it's hard to know. Clearly the summer kitchen in Loud was put in and was used successfully for decades, for generations, and they didn't have any problems. But they wouldn't be using it today, that's for sure. So it's really hard to know for how long it's been a problem. And certainly the filling in of Puddle Dock plays a role in how the water, the groundwater moves and to what elevation it's getting to. But I'm pretty sure it's pretty safe to say that over the last 30 years or so, the impacts have gotten much, much worse, especially in the basements. And then the surface flooding is even more recent. I think those of us that have been at Strawberry Bank or in the neighborhood for the last decade, all of a sudden we can count the number of times that Puddle Dock has been filled up with water due to heavy torrential rains every year. It's not like, oh, wow, I haven't seen that before. It happens all the time. So I think that's accelerating as well. But I don't think that was a long-term impact. I think that's more recent. So.
And I do have one more question that came up. We've talked about the specific solutions we've had in the houses with flooding problems, like the membranes that you put down. But do we have a viable solution to protect the entire bank? Are we taking steps, even in those houses who haven't had a flooding problem, to prevent these issues?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously around the globe, there's been some pretty amazing technology put in place to protect entire cities from flooding. Think of Venice, for example. The Thames River also has a big tide gate on it. So those are the questions and the problems that are going to have to be solved by larger communities, the city of Portsmouth, the state of New Hampshire. The Piscataqua River is going to have a negative impact on the communities along its banks. And so those communities should be the ones that are sitting down and talking about what those impacts could be and what a more wide-ranging solution could be. We know that Puddle Dock is going to flood. We know that that's going to impact our houses. I don't believe that Strawberry Bank can fix that by itself. It's a huge problem. But when we sit down with the city of Portsmouth, who controls the stormwater system, perhaps together we can come up with a way to solve the flooding issue at the 9-acre site together. So it's going to take a community to fix these problems. And especially when you look at, site-wide or community-wide or neighborhood-wide, individuals can't solve that problem. Communities have to solve that problem. So we have taken steps to be part of that community and to be at the table as those conversations are ongoing. You know, one of the sort of things I think about in my head is Puddle Dock is a big open field. It has the potential to hold a lot of water, and the Piscataqua River will take that water once the tide goes out. So we know we have an opportunity once the tide goes out to get rid of that water. The question is, how can we hold that water safely in any weather event until we can get it into the river? Annapolis, when I went to the conference a few years ago, they were grappling with seawater bubbling up through their stormwater systems in the oldest part of Annapolis. They have since designed a plan to deal with that. And basically what they did was they put in a storage container, if you will, below the stormwater system to hold the water. And once the tide goes out, then they discharge it into Chesapeake Bay. If the storm is too large and the tide is too high and it can't hold enough water, then they're going to put these gigantic pumps in and pump that dry well over the seawall back into the Chesapeake Bay. So that's what they're doing to deal with it. I mean, it sounds, you know, crazy, but it will work. So then you try to look at Puddle Dock and think, well, I wonder if we could do that just to protect our entire area. Time will tell. So I think Larry had a question, maybe?
Yes.
I'm not sure. Okay.
First of all, Rodney, thank you. This has been fascinating, and I apologize for being late. I was in the dentist chair. I much rather would have been with you. Is Newcastle in the same, does it have the same level of concern, or are the buildings high enough and far enough from the water that there's not a big issue in Newcastle?
There is not as big an issue. Certainly Newcastle has its problem areas. And there's actually a FEMA flood map presentation, I think tonight or tomorrow night, to go over those areas. But it isn't on a large scale like the city of Portsmouth, where you have a good chunk of the South End and Strawberry Bank at risk. There's individual houses that are at risk. One of the greatest examples is a house at the end of Rose Lane that has a huge amount of frontage. And they're talking about building a brand new house there, you know, gigantic house. And I suspect they will take steps to make sure that whatever the ocean throws at them, it won't matter, other than a lot of raking and pushing the beach back where it belongs. But
so can we get a gate on the Piscataqua like the one on the Thames or the one in Venice?
It's a good question. I think the hard part is what's the impact to Kittery and what's the impact to Newcastle if you put a gate at the mouth of the Piscataqua River? I don't know the answer to that. And then of course you also have Little Harbor, you know, the water comes around that way too. So that's a question for the scientists and the engineers. I don't know, but you know, one of the biggest customers, if you will, is the Portsmouth Navy Shipyard. It's a very old installation with a lot of low-lying susceptible areas, and they're going to have to deal with it too. So there's a lot of players who would be really happy if there could be a community-wide solution to the flooding along the banks of the Piscataqua River, but that's going to take a lot of conversation and money.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Rodney, and thank you all for joining us today. I did want to remind everybody our next talk is on February 16th at noon, and that will be on slavery in 18th century Portsmouth. I hope to see